On January 18, 2003, on the snowy slopes of Mount Orizaba, a 7-year-old boy left his house to play in the snow and never returned. 3 days later, his red scarf was found hanging on the door of a house at the other end of the village, at the residence of a man who swore he had never seen the boy. What investigators discovered years later about what really happened that cold January afternoon would forever change the way this quiet Mexican community would understand the secrets that can hide behind the most silent doors. Before continuing with this disturbing story, if you enjoy real mysterious cases like this, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any new cases. And tell us in the comments what country and city you're watching US from. We're curious to know where our community is spread across the world. Now, let's discover how it all began. Tlachichuca is a municipality located in the state of Puebla, Mexico, primarily known as the gateway for those seeking to climb Mount Orizaba, the highest mountain in the country. With just over 15,000 inhabitants in 2003, this community was characterized by its cobblestone streets, adobe houses painted in vibrant colors, and an economy mainly based on agriculture and mountain tourism. During the winter months, especially, between December and February, snowfalls transformed the landscape of Tlachucu into a winter postcard, an uncommon sight for Mexico. Temperatures could drop to as low as -5 degrees Celsius during the nights, and the snow accumulated on the higher streets of the village created a magical atmosphere that fascinated both local children and the few tourists who ventured there during this time of year. On Benito Juarez Street, number 47, a sky blue house with white window frames was home to the Campos Rios family. Eliseo Campos, 34, worked as a mountain guide for the groups that arrived to climb Mount Orizaba, while his wife, Maricela Rios, 29, ran a small textile business from their home. The couple had 2 children, Joaquin, 7, and his younger sister, Ciclali, just 4 years old. Joaquin was a particularly curious and adventurous child, with jet black hair that always seemed tousled and dark brown eyes that sparkled with excitement every time he saw snow falling. He was the type of child who found wonder in the simplest things. He could spend hours building snowmen, chasing snowflakes with his tongue sticking out, or simply watching the vapor of his breath condense in the cold air. His parents described him as a responsible boy for his age, who always informed them where he was going to play and returned home before it got dark. He attended the Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla Rural Elementary School, where he was in 2nd grade and was known for his ease with mathematics and his love for adventure stories. In 2003, the community of Tlachuca maintained the characteristics of a small town where everyone knew each other. The children played freely in the streets with little supervision. Neighbors greeted each other by name, and the doors of homes rarely remained locked during the day. It was the kind of place where a child's disappearance was not only shocking, but practically unthinkable. The winter of 2003 had been particularly intense in terms of snowfall. The National Meteorological Service had recorded snow accumulations of up to 20 centimeters in the higher parts of the municipality, something not seen since 1987. The children of the village were ecstatic. Many of them, including Joaquin, had never seen so much snow accumulated on the streets of their community. Saturday, January 18, 2003, dawned with a gray, leaden sky that promised more snow. The temperature had dropped to -2 degrees Celsius during the early hours, and a fresh layer of 10 centimeters had fallen on top of the snow already accumulated from previous days. The streets of Tlachuco looked like a fairy tale landscape, with white rooftops and trees covered in frost. Joaquin woke up at 7:30 in the morning, early even for a Saturday. From his window, he could see the street covered with fresh snow, and his excitement was palpable. During breakfast, consisting of hot oatmeal and sweet bread, he couldn't stop talking about his plans for the day. He wanted to build the biggest snowman he had ever made. His mother, Maricela, was preparing orders of woolen sweaters that she had to deliver the following week, while his father, Eliseo, was getting ready for a 2-day expedition to Mount Orizaba with a group of mountaineers from Mexico City. It was a typical family situation. The father working during the busy winter tourism season, the mother focused on her business, and the children anticipating a day of playing in the snow dot at 9:15 in the morning. Joaquin, dressed in his winter clothes, a gray wool sweater knitted by his grandmother, denim pants, black rubber boots, and his favorite red scarf, handmade by his Aunt Rebecca the year before. The scarf was particularly special to him because it had small designs of mountains and stars woven with golden thread. "Mom, I'm going to play outside with Taddeo and Maximiliano," Joaquin announced, referring to 2 neighborhood friends who lived on the same street. "We're going to have a snowman building contest." Maricela looked up from her work. "Okay, my love, but don't go too far from the house and come back for lunch at 1 o'clock. Your dad is leaving soon and wants to say goodbye to you." Joaquin nodded enthusiastically and left the house at exactly 9:25. Maricela would later remember this detail precisely because at that moment the village church clock rang, marking the half hour. The first witnesses of the day were his friends. Taddeo Pacheco, 8, lived 3 houses down on the same street. According to his later testimony, Joaquin arrived at his house around 9:30, and together they went to find Maximiliano Leal, who lived on the corner of Benito Juarez and Revolucion. The 3 boys spent the morning building snowmen in the small park in front of the village church. Several neighbors saw them playing between 10 o'clock and 11:30. Donna Cecilia Sandoval, who ran a small grocery store across from the park, would later recall seeing the 3 boys laughing and throwing snowballs. Around noon, according to Taddeo and Maximiliano, Joaquin told them he was going home for some gloves because his hands had gotten wet and he was cold. He promised to return in 15 minutes. The 2 friends continued playing, waiting for him. This was the last time anyone saw Joaquin Campos Rios alive. At 12:45, Taddeo and Maximiliano became concerned because their friend had not returned. They decided to go look for him at his house. When they knocked on the door, Maricela asked them about Joaquin, believing he was still with them. The confusion quickly turned into alarm. "What do you mean he's not with you?" Maricela asked, her voice already betraying nervousness. "He went to get his gloves more than half an hour ago." The boys exchanged worried looks. Taddeo explained that Joaquin had left the park, saying he was going home, but never came back. Maximiliano added that they had waited a long time before going to look for him. Maricela quickly searched the entire house, checking every room, the backyard, even the small tool shed where Joaquin sometimes hid to play. There was no trace of him. On the coat rack at the entrance, she noticed that her son's gloves were still hanging exactly where he had left them the night before. A wave of anguish immediately gripped her. Joaquin was a punctual and responsible boy. He would never be absent without letting anyone know, especially knowing that his father was leaving for a trip and would want to say goodbye. At 1:15 in the afternoon, Maricela began searching the nearby streets, accompanied by Taddeo and Maximiliano, who wanted to help find their friend. They asked at every house on the block. No one had seen Joaquin since the morning. Eliseo returned home at 2 o'clock to collect his gear and say goodbye to the family before heading to Mount Orizaba. He found his wife in a total panic, walking back and forth in the living room, while Ciclale cried in her arms, frightened by her mother's visible distress. "I can't find Joaquin," Maricela told him, her voice trembling. "He left at 9:30, said he would come back for his gloves at noon, but he never came. I've searched the whole neighborhood." Eliseo immediately canceled his expedition. By 3 p.m., he had organized a search group with neighbors and family. They systematically checked every street in the village, every abandoned house, every corner where a child could have taken refuge from the cold, or where he could have had an accident. At 4:30 p.m., as the sun began to set and the temperature quickly dropped, Eliseo decided to contact the authorities. He went to the nearest public prosecutor's office in the municipal seat of San Nicolas, Buenos Aires, 20 minutes by car from Tlacuca. The public prosecutor, Licenciado Herminio Villalobos, received the report at 5:15 p.m., although the regulation stated that a missing minor must be missing for at least 24 hours before a formal investigation can begin. The nature of the case and the extreme weather conditions led the official to immediately activate the search protocol. By 6 p.m. on January 18th, police patrols and civil protection officers were already combing not only Tlachucoca, but also the neighboring villages of Calcajalco and Atzitintla. A search perimeter of 5 kilometers was established around the last point where Joaquin had been seen. The night of January 18, 2003, was one of the coldest recorded in the region that season, with temperatures dropping to -7 degrees Celsius. The search teams worked with flashlights and torches until 11 p.m. when the weather conditions became too dangerous to continue. That first night was spent in absolute wakefulness at the Campos Rios house. Neighbors, family, and friends took turns keeping company with Eliseo and Maricela, who kept repeating the sequence of events from that day, as if doing so might reveal some detail that could explain her son's disappearance. The entire community of Tlachucoca mobilized in a way that had never been seen before. Neighborhood differences, small everyday conflicts, everything was put aside in the urgency to find Joaquin. It was as if the whole town had adopted the boy as their own. On Sunday, January 19th, the day began with light but persistent snowfall. The search teams reorganized at dawn, this time with the participation of state police and a specialized mountain rescue team that had arrived from the city of Puebla during the night. The commander in charge of the operation, Captain Rogelio Acosta Arucia, a 45-year-old man with more than 20 years of experience in search operations, established his operations base in the town's primary school. From there, he coordinated teams systematically checking every ravine, every cave, and every abandoned building within a 10 kilometers radius. In cases like this, Captain Acosta explained to local journalists who had started to arrive in the village, the first 72 hours are crucial. A 7-year-old child cannot survive more than 2 nights at these temperatures without proper shelter. His words, although realistic, were like a harsh blow to Eliseo and Maricela. Joaquin's mother had developed an obsessive routine. Every hour, exactly on the hour, she would leave the house and shout her son's name towards the 4 cardinal points, as if it were a ritual that might bring him back. The second day of the search extended beyond the village. Teams with tracking dogs checked the paths leading to the slopes of Mount Orizaba. Other groups headed towards the pine forest to the west of Tlachuca, an area where the village children sometimes went to play, although it was considered unsafe for minors without adult supervision. During that day, some objects were found that initially caused a stir. A piece of blue cloth caught in a bush, small footprints in the snow that seemed to belong to a child, scraps of food someone might have left behind. However, none of these findings were related to Joaquin. That Sunday night, January 19th, the temperature dropped even further, reaching -9 degrees Celsius. At the Campos Rios house, the reality began to cruelly set in. Eliseo, who had remained strong during the first 36 hours, emotionally broke down that second night. He was found sitting in Joaquin's room, holding one of his son's t-shirts and silently crying. Maricela, on the other hand, seemed to have entered a kind of active state of denial. She refused to eat, sleep, or do anything other than search for her son. She had lost 3 kilograms in 2 days, and her eyes had acquired that empty look characteristic of those who are experiencing extreme trauma. On Monday, January 20th, the 3rd day of the disappearance, the case began receiving national media attention. TV Azteca sent a team of reporters, and the story of the lost boy in the snow appeared on the noon news broadcasts of several television channels. It was precisely this media coverage that generated the first major breakthrough in the case, although in a way, no one expected Dot at 3:30 p.m. on Monday. January 20th, Mr. Crisanto Elizondo Carrera, a 67-year-old retiree living on Morales Street, at the opposite end of the village, went to the operations base at the primary school with something he had found that morning. Crisanto was known in the village as a solitary but kind man who had worked for over 30 years as a maintenance employee at a telecommunications company in the city of Orizaba. He had retired 5 years earlier and lived alone in a 2-story house that he had inherited from his parents. He was the kind of person who went unnoticed, with no family of his own, no conflicts with anyone, and no close friendships. "Commander," he said to Rogelio Acosta, his voice trembling, "I found this hanging on my door this morning." In his hands, he held a red hand-knitted scarf with small designs of mountains and stars in golden thread. It was unmistakably Joaquin Campos Rios's scarf. The impact of this discovery was immediate and devastating. Eliseo and Maricela were urgently called to identify the item. Maricela collapsed in tears as soon as she saw the scarf. There was no doubt it belonged to her son. "How did this end up on your door, Mr. Elizondo?" Commander Acosta asked, his tone no longer just collecting information, but now resembling an interrogation. Crisanto, visibly nervous, explained that he had left his house at 7 a.m. to buy the newspaper at Dona Cecilia's store. Upon returning, around 7:20, he found the scarf hanging on the doorknob of his front door. "I thought maybe a neighbor had lost it," said Crisanto, his hands shaking. "I didn't know it belonged to the missing child. When I saw the news on TV and they showed the photo of the boy with that scarf, I immediately knew I had to bring it." Here, Crisanto's statement raised troubling questions. His house was more than 8 blocks away from the park where Joaquin had last played with his friends. There was no logical reason why the boy's scarf would have appeared specifically on his door and not anywhere else in the village. Even more disturbing was the condition of the scarf. Despite having supposedly been exposed to sub-zero temperatures in snow overnight, the scarf showed no signs of being exposed to extreme weather conditions. It was dry, clean, and showed no stiffness that it would have developed from freezing. "Commander," Acosta made the decision to turn the search into a formal criminal investigation. Crisanto Elizondo Carrera was immediately made the primary person of interest in the case. The following days were marked by growing tension in Tlaquecuca. The appearance of the scarf had completely changed the nature of the situation. It was no longer just about a missing child in the snow. Now there was concrete evidence that someone had been in contact with Joaquin after his disappearance. Crisanto was subjected to extensive questioning for 3 consecutive days. His house was searched from top to bottom by forensic experts. His clothes, his car, every corner of his property was examined. However, no physical evidence was found that directly linked him to Joaquin's disappearance. His alibi for Saturday, January 18th, was solid. He had spent the morning at home reading, the afternoon watching television, and had dinner that evening at La Cabana restaurant in the center of the village with a waitress and other customers. Confirmed his presence between 8 o'clock and 10 p.m. Nonetheless, the appearance of the scarf on his door remained an inexplicable mystery. Who had placed it there? Why specifically at Crisanto's house? And where was Joaquin? Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. The investigation entered that phase where each new lead turned out to be a dead end, where each testimony revealed more inconsistencies than certainties. By March 2003, the official search teams had been withdrawn. The case remained officially open, but with no significant progress. Crisanto Elizondo had returned to his normal routine, though now he carried the permanent suspicion of his neighbors. Many in the village were convinced that he knew more than he had revealed, though there was no evidence to support any accusations. The Campos Rios family entered a spiral of pain and deterioration. Eliseo developed severe alcohol problems and eventually lost his job as a mountain guide. Maricela fell into a deep depression that required hospitalization on 2 occasions. Little Ciclali, who was only 4 years old when her brother disappeared, began showing behavioral problems that would persist for years. The Blue House on Benito Juarez Street, number 47, became a silent monument to pain. Maricela kept Joaquin's room exactly as it had been left on the morning of January 18th. His unmade bed, his toys scattered on the floor, his clothes from the previous day hanging on the chair. Every January 18th, on the anniversary of the disappearance, the family held a mass at the village church and a silent walk to the park where Joaquin had last played. As the years went by, fewer people participated in these events, but Eliseo and Maricela never missed them. Regardless of the weather conditions, the village of Tlachicuca also changed after January 2003. The sense of security that had characterized the community faded. Parents stopped allowing their children to play alone in the streets. Doors that once remained open began to be locked. The mutual trust between neighbors eroded, replaced by suspicions and mistrust. Crisanto Elizondo became a ghostly figure in his own community. Although he was never formally accused of any crime, the social stigma followed him for years. Many neighbors avoided him on the streets. Conversations stopped when he approached, and the village children had begun to see his house as a sinister place. He, for his part, never moved away from Tlachicuca despite the social pressure. In later interviews with investigators, he always maintained his innocence and his confusion as to how Joaquin's scarf had ended up on his door. "I don't understand why someone would do something like that," he would constantly repeat. "Why? Hang that scarf specifically on my door? If someone wanted to get rid of it, they could have thrown it anywhere in the village. Why involve me?" It was a question that had no answer, and this lack of a logical explanation kept the case in a frustrating limbo for years. In the fall of 2018, 15 years after Joaquin's disappearance, Tlachicuca was preparing for an urban modernization project funded by the state government. One of the initiatives included the renovation of the town's drainage system, which dated back to the 1970s and showed significant signs of deterioration. On October 3, 2018, a crew of workers from the construction company Infrastructura Poblana S.A. began excavation work on Morelos Street, precisely in front of house number 23, where Crisanto Elizondo lived. The foreman of the project, engineer Marcelo Santibazes, had planned that the work in this specific section would take about a week. They were replacing 60 centimeters diameter concrete pipes with larger capacity PVC installations. The first day of excavation went without incident. The workers removed the asphalt pavement and began digging until they reached the level of the existing pipes, approximately 1.8 meters deep. On October 4th, while deepening the excavation in the section extending from the sidewalk to the center of the street, one of the heavy machinery operators, Mr. Ovidio Dominguez, noticed something unusual. "Engineer," he shouted to Santibazes, "there's something here. It doesn't look like cable. It seems ... It seems like clothing." Marcelo Santibazes immediately halted operations and went over to inspect. At 2.2 meters deep, partially covered by sediments and fill material, Cloth remnants and what appeared to be small bones were clearly visible. The engineer's experience in construction projects had taught him to immediately recognize the implications of such a discovery. Without touching anything, he ordered all workers to move away from the area and contacted the municipal authorities immediately. By 11:30 a.m. on October 4, 2018, municipal police arrived at the site, followed shortly after by staff from the Puebla State Attorney General's office. The area was cordoned off, and a 50-meter security perimeter was established. The news spread through Tlaxicuca like wildfire. In a town where few things remained secret for more than an hour, the discovery of human remains in front of Crisanto Elizondo's house caused an immediate shock. By 2 p.m., a specialized forensic team was working on carefully excavating the site. The forensic anthropologists confirmed preliminarily that the remains belonged to a minor. Based on the size and characteristics of the bones found, Eliseo and Maricela Campos were officially notified of the discovery at 3:15 p.m. The couple, now 49 and 44 years old respectively, had aged considerably over the 15 years of uncertainty. Eliseo had managed to control his alcoholism a few years earlier, and Maricela had found emotional stability through psychological therapy and medication. The possibility that they had finally found Joaquin stirred contradictory emotions within them. On one hand, the prospect of getting answers after so many years of torment. On the other, the definitive confirmation that their son had been dead all this time. After 15 years, we already knew in our hearts that Joaquin was not going to return, Maricela would later say in an interview. But there was always that little hope. You know, that voice telling you maybe he's alive somewhere. Now that voice would finally be silenced. The forensic excavation continued for 3 days. The experts recovered almost a complete skeleton, along with fragments of clothing that had partially resisted decomposition due to the particular soil and climate conditions of the region. Among the objects found were remnants of a gray wool sweater, denim pants, rubber boots, and what the investigators identified as fragments of golden thread that might have belonged to decorations on a scarf. October 7, 2018, the DNA test would definitively confirm that the remains belonged to Joaquin Campos Rios. The boy who had disappeared in the snow 15 years earlier had been buried all this time less than 10 meters from Crisanto Elizondo's door. This discovery completely transformed the perspective of the case. It was no longer just a mysterious disappearance, but a murder that had remained hidden for a decade and a half. Crisanto Elizondo, now 82 years old, was immediately arrested on suspicion of homicide. However, his lawyers argued that the fact that the body had been found near his house did not constitute enough evidence for a formal accusation, especially considering that he had been the one to deliver the scarf to the authorities in 2003. The criminal investigation, which resumed in October 2018, took a completely different approach than 15 years earlier. The investigative team, led by homicide specialist prosecutor Maria Elena Quiroga, now had access to modern forensic technologies that did not exist in 2003. The first analyses revealed disturbing details about Joaquin's death. The examination of the skeleton showed a fracture in the skull consistent with a blunt force blow, as well as fractures in several ribs that suggested possible compression trauma. The evidence suggests that the child suffered significant traumatic injuries that likely led to his death, explained forensic doctor Dr. Aurelio Medrano in his preliminary report. However, determining the exact cause of death after 15 years presented considerable technical challenges. Even more intriguing was the analysis of the site where the body had been buried. Soil studies indicated that the original excavation had been done with precise tools, possibly a shovel and pickaxe, and that the body had been carefully placed at a specific depth. It was not a hasty or improvised burial, explained forensic expert Licenciada Fernanda Solis. Whoever did this had knowledge of construction or excavation work. They knew exactly what depth was needed so that the body would not be detected by conventional means, but would not decompose completely either. This observation shifted the investigation towards an aspect that had gone unnoticed in 2003, Crisanto Elizondo's work history. His 30 years working in maintenance for a telecommunications company had included significant experience with excavation for underground cable installations. Investigators found employment records confirming that Crisanto had participated in underground infrastructure projects in various municipalities in the region from 1975 to 1998. He had technical knowledge about excavation depths, soil types, and methods to prevent buried installations from being detected at the same time. Prosecutor Quiroga ordered a thorough review of all the testimonies collected in 2003. Using modern voice analysis technology and more sophisticated interrogation techniques, the investigative team began identifying inconsistencies in Crisanto's original statements. On October 15, 2018, Crisanto was subjected to a new formal interrogation. This time, investigators had solid forensic evidence and a clearer understanding of his technical capabilities. Mr. Elizondo, Prosecutor Quiroga said, "We know you had the knowledge and experience necessary to perform an excavation at the exact depth where we found Joaquin's body. Can you explain to us what you were specifically doing between noon and 6 p.m. on January 18, 2003? Crisanto, now a frail 82-year-old man, maintained the same version he had given 15 years earlier. He had been at home during the morning and afternoon and had gone out to dinner at the restaurant in the evening. However, modern technology allowed investigators to analyze evidence that had been impossible to process in 2003. Soil samples found on Crisanto's gardening tools were subjected to comparative geological analysis with the soil from the site where Joaquin had been buried. Results were revealing. Microscopic particles of a specific type of clay found only in deep layers of the soil on Marilla Street were identified on a shovel and pickaxe that had been stored in Crisanto's garage for the past 15 years. When this evidence was presented to him, Crisanto showed visible signs of nervousness for the first time since his arrest. His lawyer, Licenciado Damian Cervantes, requested a break in the interrogation to consult with his client. During the break, something unexpected happened. Crisanto asked to speak with Prosecutor Quiroga without his lawyer present. It was an unusual request that generated immediate curiosity within the investigative team. "Prosecutor," Crisanto said, with a voice that had lost the firmness he had maintained for days, "there's something I never told you in 2003, something I thought wasn't important, but now I understand it might be." Prosecutor Quiroga immediately activated the recording equipment. Everything Crisanto said from that moment on would be recorded as part of the official record. "On January 18, 2003, Crisanto began, "I wasn't alone at my house all afternoon. As I told you, I had a visitor. Someone came to see me around 1 p.m. This revelation completely changed the direction of the investigation. For 15 years, Crisanto had omitted crucial information about the events of the day Joaquin disappeared. "Who visited you, Mr. Elizondo?" the prosecutor asked. Crisanto hesitated for a moment, as though weighing the consequences of what he was about to reveal. "It was someone I knew well, someone I trusted, but I never imagined that this visit could be related to what happened to the boy." The tension in the interrogation room was palpable. After 15 years, they were finally about to get new information about the events of January 18, 2003. "I need you to tell us who that person was," Prosecutor Quiroga insisted. Crisanto closed his eyes for a moment, as if gathering the courage for what he was about to say. "It was Eliseo Campos," he whispered, "Joaquin's father. He came to my house that afternoon." The revelation from Crisanto Elizondo created a stunned silence in the interrogation room. Prosecutor Quiroga needed several seconds to fully process the implications of what she had just heard. Are you saying that Eliseo Campos, Joaquin's father, visited you at your house the afternoon of January 18th, 2003, the same day his son disappeared? The prosecutor asked, needing confirmation of something that seemed impossible to believe. Crisanto nodded slowly. Yes, he arrived around 1:30 p.m. He was very upset, very nervous. He said something terrible had happened. Over the next 90 minutes, Crisanto revealed a version of events that was radically different from everything that had been known about the case for the past 15 years. According to his testimony, Eliseo had arrived at his house that afternoon carrying something wrapped in a blanket. He was visibly in shock and asked Crisanto for help, explaining that something terrible had happened. He told me Joaquin had come home to get his gloves, as planned, Crisanto recounted. But when he arrived, he found Eliseo preparing his gear for the expedition to the peak of Orizaba. The boy was very excited and wanted to accompany his father. According to Eliseo's version that Crisanto was revealing, there was an argument between father and son. Joaquin insisted on going on the expedition, arguing that he was 7 years old and old enough to go with his father to the mountain. Eliseo told me he lost his patience, Crisanto continued, his voice trembling. He shouted at the boy. He told him he couldn't go because he was too young and it was too dangerous. Joaquin started crying and insisting, and then Crisanto paused, as if the next words were too difficult to say. Eliseo told me he pushed Joaquin to get him away, but the boy tripped and fell backward, hitting his head against the corner of a metal table they had in the backyard. Prosecutor Quiroga felt the ground shift beneath her feet. If this was true, it meant that the entire investigation over the past 15 years had been based on a false premise. And what happened afterward? The prosecutor asked. Eliseo, said Joaquin, lost consciousness immediately. Crisanto continued. There was a lot of bleeding. He tried to wake him up, but the boy didn't respond. He waited a few minutes, trying to decide what to do, but then realized Joaquin had died. The story Crisanto was telling was horrible in its simplicity, a domestic accident that escalated into tragedy because of the panic and desperate decisions of a father who didn't know how to handle the situation. Why did he come to you for? Help? Asked the prosecutor. Because he knew I had experience with excavations, replied Crisanto. He asked me to help him bury Joaquin's body. He said that if people found out he had accidentally killed his own son, his life and his family's life would be ruined forever. Crisanto explained that he had agreed to help Eliseo, not because he agreed with the decision, but because he could. See the state of total panic the man was in. We waited until it got dark, he said. Around 8 p.m., when there was no one on the streets, we dug a hole in the street right in front of my house. He chose that spot because he knew no one would. Suspect the body was buried so close to where the family lived. The logic was disturbing but effective. Who would search for a missing child's body just 8 blocks from their own house, especially on a street where a person had already been seen as a suspect? And the scarf? The prosecutor asked, recalling the item that had set the course of the entire original investigation. That was Eliseo's idea, replied Crisanto. He said he needed to divert attention to me so he could participate in the search without raising suspicions. He asked me to hang the scarf on my door and for it to be found a few days later. Prosecutor Quiroga realized she was hearing the confession of an extraordinarily sophisticated psychological manipulation. Eliseo had carefully orchestrated an investigation that would make him the victim instead of the perpetrator, while directing suspicions toward an innocent man. Why didn't you tell us this in 2003? The prosecutor asked. Crisanto lowered his head. Because Eliseo convinced me that if I revealed the truth, we would both go to prison. He for the accidental homicide, and I for covering it up. He told me that his family had already lost a son, and they couldn't lose the father too. Chrysantos. Testimony painted a picture of emotional manipulation, where Eliseo had taken advantage of a compassionate, older man's fear to make him an accomplice in a cover-up. All these years, continued Chrysanto, I lived with the weight of knowing where Joaquin was. Every time I saw Maricela suffer, every time there was an anniversary mass, I knew the truth, but I also knew revealing it wouldn't bring the boy back. It would only destroy more lives. Prosecutor Quiroga immediately ordered the arrest of Eliseo Campos. However, when agents arrived at the Blue House on Benito Juarez Street, number 47, they found that Eliseo had disappeared. Maricela, confused and terrified, told them her husband had left the house that morning, saying he was going to do some errands in Puebla, but he had not returned. His cell phone was disconnected, and he hadn't left any information about where he was. The search for Eliseo Campos became a state operation involving highways, airports, and border crossings. Investigators believed he had anticipated that Chrysanto would eventually reveal the truth and had prepared an escape route. 3 days later, on October 18, 2018, exactly 15 years after Joaquin's disappearance, Eliseo Campos was found in a hotel in Veracruz, 4 hours away from Tlacuca. When arrested, he did not resist. According to the officers who made the arrest, he appeared to be a man who had been waiting for this moment for a long time. On October 22, 2018, Eliseo Campos was transported back to Puebla to face formal charges of manslaughter and covering up a crime. His first official interrogation took place in the presence of his defense lawyer, Licenciado Patricio Maldonado, and specialized prosecutor, Maria Elena Quiroga. Eliseo, now 49, was a physically deteriorated man affected by 15 years of alcoholism and psychological stress. His hair had turned completely gray, his face showed deep lines of worry, and his hands trembled constantly, both from anxiety and the effects of alcohol withdrawal syndrome. During the first 2 hours of interrogation, Eliseo remained silent, only answering the questions asked without commenting. However, when the prosecutor informed him that Chrysanto Elizondo had revealed all the details of January 18, 2003, his resistance completely broke down. I can't take it anymore, Eliseo said, breaking into tears. I've lived 15 years in hell. Every night I see my son's face. Every day I wake up remembering that I was the one who killed him. What followed was a full confession that confirmed and expanded on the details revealed by Chrysanto. Eliseo provided a detailed version of the events of January 18, 2003, painting a devastating picture of a moment of rage that had destroyed multiple lives. According to Eliseo, the events had started exactly as Chrysanto had described. Joaquin had returned home around noon, not just for his gloves, but because he had seen his father preparing the mountaineering equipment and had suddenly developed an obsession with joining him on the expedition. My son was very persistent when something got in his head, explained Eliseo. He followed me around the house, insisting that he was big enough to come with me. I explained to him it was too dangerous, that the weather conditions were extreme, and that he didn't have the right gear for a child his age. The situation escalated when Joaquin started crying and clinging to his father's backpack, begging him to take him. Eliseo, who was under time pressure because the group of mountaineers was waiting for him at 3 p.m., lost his patience. I yelled at him, Eliseo admitted. I told him to stop acting like a baby, to go play with his friends, and leave me alone to work. Joaquin cried louder and clung tighter to my backpack. In a moment of frustration, Eliseo had pushed his son to free the equipment. The push had been stronger than he intended, and Joaquin had tripped backward. The backyard was wet from the melting snow, Eliseo explained. Joaquin slipped and fell backward. Eliseo said that Joaquin's head hit the corner of a metal table they used to clean the mountaineering equipment. The sound of the impact, Eliseo described, was something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Joaquin lost consciousness immediately, and the amount of blood was alarming. I tried to wake him up, Eliseo continued. I spoke to him, gently moved him, but he didn't respond. There was a lot of blood coming from his head. I waited, I don't know, maybe 10 minutes, thinking he would wake up, but he didn't move, didn't breathe. Faced with the reality that he had accidentally killed his own son, Eliseo went into total panic. His first instinct was to call an ambulance, but the understanding of the legal and social consequences paralyzed him. He knew that if he called the authorities, everything would end, he explained. My career as a guide, the stability of my family, everything. Maricela would never forgive me. Ciale would grow up knowing his father had killed his brother. The decision to conceal the accident had been made in a state of extreme panic, but its execution required careful planning that Eliseo developed in the following hours. I remembered that Crisanto had experience with excavations, he recounted. He lived alone. He was a discreet person, and I thought I could maybe convince him to help me if I explained it had been an accident. The conversation with Crisanto had been, according to Eliseo, one of the hardest moments of his life. He had to convince an older man to help him bury his own son's body, arguing that it was the only way to protect his family from an even greater tragedy. Crisanto is a good man, Eliseo said. He didn't want to help me at first, but when I explained that Maricela was pregnant at that time, This was a new revelation that neither Crisanto nor the investigators knew. Maricela had been 3 months pregnant in January 2003, but she lost the baby 2 weeks after Joaquin's disappearance due to extreme stress. I told Crisanto that if the scandal came to light, Maricela would lose the baby she was expecting. Eliseo continued. That my family would lose not just Joaquin, but also the baby coming. That convinced him. The plan they carried out that night was designed to create as much confusion as possible. Burying the body near Crisanto's house was a strategic decision to divert suspicion away from Eliseo. The idea of the scarf was mine, Eliseo admitted. I knew that if Crisanto found something that belonged to Joaquin, he would automatically become a suspect. That would allow me to participate in the search as a grieving father rather than being investigated as a possible perpetrator. The psychological manipulation Eliseo had exercised over 15 years extended beyond Crisanto. He had consciously worked to keep Maricela's hope alive, feeding theories about possible kidnappers or mountain accidents. All the while, he knew exactly where his son was buried. Every time Maricela mentioned a new theory about what could have happened to Joaquin, I encouraged her, he confessed. I preferred that she lived with false hope than with the truth that I had killed our son. When Prosecutor Quiroga asked about his life during the 15 years after the crime, Eliseo described an existence dominated by guilt, self-loathing, and alcohol dependency. Not a single day went by without thinking about Joaquin, he said. I developed compulsive rituals. Every night I went to the place where he was buried and apologized. Every January 18th, during the memorial masses, I had to act as a grieving father while knowing I was responsible for his death. Eliseo's alcoholism, which had started immediately after the crime, had been his escape mechanism from a psychologically unbearable reality. However, paradoxically, it had also been part of his self-imposed punishment. I wanted to die, he explained. Every day I hoped the alcohol would finally kill me, but at the same time, I knew that if I died, Crisanto would carry the weight of the secret forever. I couldn't do that to him. Eliseo's confession provided the closure that the family and community had needed for a decade and a half, but it also opened new wounds. Maricela, who had waited for 15 years for the return of her son, now had to confront the reality that her husband had been responsible for his death from the very beginning. On November 15, 2018, Eliseo Campos pleaded guilty to charges of manslaughter and cover-up. He was sentenced to 18 years in prison, a sentence that the judge described as a reflection of both the accidental nature of the homicide and the severity of the subsequent cover-up and manipulation. Elizondo, despite his cooperation with the authorities, was sentenced to 5 years in prison for cover-up, though the judge recommended that he serve his sentence under house arrest due to his advanced age and health issues. On the day of the sentencing, in a scene that moved everyone present in the courtroom, Maricela approached Crisanto to ask for forgiveness. "You suffered for 15 years for something you didn't do," she told him. "My husband made you a victim just as much as we were. I'm so sorry." With tears in his eyes, Crisanto responded, "I have nothing to forgive you, ma'am. You too were a victim of your husband's lies. I just hope that now you can find peace." This case shows us how a moment of uncontrolled rage can destroy not only the life of a direct victim, but the lives of many people for decades. The story of Joaquin Campos teaches us that the darkest family secrets may be hidden behind the most convincing facades of pain and loss. For 15 years, an entire community lived with unjust suspicion toward an innocent man, while the real perpetrator not only evaded justice, but actively participated in keeping alive a lie that caused further suffering to everyone involved. What do you think of this story? Were you able to detect the signs of Eliseo's manipulation throughout all these years? Do you think Crisanto made the right decision by keeping the secret for so long? Or should he have revealed the truth immediately? Human psychology under extreme stress can lead us to make decisions that seem rational at the time, but have devastating long-term consequences. Eliseo Campos turned a terrible accident into a tragedy that destroyed many lives, not only through the accidental homicide, but also through his conscious decision to construct 15 years of lies to avoid facing the consequences of his actions. Share your thoughts in the comments. If this investigation impacted you as much as it did us, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss more cases like this. Give us a like if you believe stories like this help us better understand the complexity of human nature under extreme circumstances.